You can have your
Main event of the evening.
ready to race to you.
These days are
Hello and welcome to These Days Are Ours, a Happy Days podcast. I'm Peter.
And I'm Joe.
And today we are discussing Season 10, Episode 6, Who Gives a Hootenanny?
Okay, Peter, tell us what happens in Who Gives a Hootenanny.
We open at Arnold's, where Jenny is trying to convince Casey to help her out on a test. Definitely not cheating.
Well, it's sharing. Helping out a friend in need.
Roger is lamenting how little he and Fonzie make as teachers, though Fonzie is less bothered since he has other sources of income. He hits the jukebox, and to his horror, what comes out is folk music.
The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind.
He demands to know what happened from Arnold, who explains that he changed the records today, all to folk music. Rock and roll is out, and you have to change with the times. Fonzie says nothing changes without his permission, and the Times didn't ask his permission. He starts throwing out the records, to the restaurant goer's horror, and not even a lecture from Roger can stop him.
Folk music just represents the popularization of a form of music that has existed for centuries.
Over at the Cunningham house, Joanie and Chachi have arrived, to Marion's joy. They tell her their band is going to be on TV tomorrow night. Casey comes down, and Joanie doesn't recognize her at first. Once her memory is jogged, she and Casey do an old hand clap routine. She and Chachi then leave for rehearsal, much to Marion's dismay.
No, dear, no, please. Mrs. C, we'll be back for dinner. Yeah, prove it. Leave me your wallet.
Joanie and Chachi arrive to rehearse for the show Hootenanny, and when they start to perform, the manager stops them to explain they're a folk music show, not rock and roll. Chachi says they play rock and roll, or not at all. The manager calls their bluff.
Either we sing a rock and roll song, or we don't do your show. Next!
And they quickly start singing Jimmy Crack Corn. At the Cunningham house, Fonzie arrives just in time for dinner, but he isn't hungry. Marion convinces Howard to talk to Fonzie, and Fonzie admits he's upset about the popularity of folk music.
Music is changing again.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I know exactly what you mean.
Howard can sympathize. That's how he felt when rock and roll replaced big band music. Nevertheless, Fonzie still intends to fight for the music he loves. Joanie and Chachi arrive and tell Fonzie they're going to be on national television. He's happy for them, until they mention they'll be singing folk music. Fonzie, naturally, accuses them of stabbing him in the back.
Rock and roll forever.
The next day, Howard, Marion, Fonzie, and Ashley are going to go to the show, except Fonzie refuses to go because he hates folk music. Ashley sends Howard and Marion off, and talks to Fonzie about his hatred of folk music. Fonzie is now thinking that it might be a communist plot to bore everyone to sleep so they can come in and take over. Ashley correctly surmises Fonzie's afraid of change, and reassures him that nothing will change who he is.
Fonzie.
Yeah?
Nothing is going to change who you are.
At Hootenanny, Joanie and Chachi are about to perform, though they're not sure about the song they wrote.
I honestly think that if we sing the ballad of the left-footed sheriff, our career's gonna end like that.
Fonzie goes to talk to them, and apologizes for his earlier behavior in his own way. He does end up convincing them to do what they want to do, and Joanie and Chachi do a folk rendition of one of their rock songs. It goes over wonderfully. The assembled Cunninghams celebrate at the house, and see Joanie and Chachi off.
You know, someday we can have a sign that says, Joanie and Chachi slept here. Separate rooms, of course.
Alone, Howard and Marion slow dance together.
Thank you, Peter. That was Who Gives a Hootenanny. It first aired back on November 16th, 1982. Happy Days was followed that night by a new Laverne and Shirley, in which Laverne is duped into robbing a bank and is sent to state prison. This was the first half of a two-parter. CBS had a new episode of Bring 'Em Back Alive, in which Frank's plane crashes in the jungle and Frank desperately needs medical attention.
I was stranded in the jungle, afraid and alone, trying to figure a way to get a message back home.
And NBC had a new episode of Father Murphy. This week, Murphy's wife, May, announces she's pregnant. Unfortunately, one of the orphans, Will, feels ignored and runs away when the baby is born. This is also the first half of a two-parter. So, Peter, of those three choices, what are you watching?
Well, as thrilling as it sounds to watch a guy bleed out in the jungle on prime time, I'm probably going to watch Happy Days and Laverne and Shirley tonight, because I really want to see how one gets tricked into accidentally robbing a bank.
I definitely want to see Laverne go to prison and how she handles that. But I gotta say that the makers of Father Murphy are going hard as hell in season 2. Who Gives a Hootenanny was directed by Jerry Paris, and it was written by Rhea Nepes. This was Rhea's last Happy Days script. She previously wrote Richie Falls in Love, Dreams Can Come True, A Potsy is Born, and more. After Happy Days, she worked on Just Our Luck, Safe at Home, and The Red Fox Show. As for guest stars this week, let's start with Brad Blaisdell as Lou, apparently the director or producer of the TV show.
Hey, you can't do rock and roll on Hootenanny. This is a folk music show.
Brad appeared as the same character back in season 8. Back then, he was working on the game show Dreams Can Come True. We already talked about Brad's better-known TV and film credits, including his recurring role as a bartender on Three's Company. This time, I'll mention the fact that he's in
The Unnameable 2, Blood Fist 3, The Terror Within 2, In the Heat of Passion 2, Body Chemistry 4, and Night Eyes 4.
Brad died in 2018 at the age of 69. Peter, what did you think of Brad Blaisdell as Lou?
He was a blast. He only had one very brief scene, but it was very fun that he just immediately called Joanie and Chachi's bluff.
I thought he was very fun in this episode, too. And it was nice that Rhea Nepis, the writer of this episode, remembered the character of Lou from her previous episode and brought him back for this one.
It is kind of weird that the show didn't think to check what genre Joanie and Chachi's band plays before they hired them to be on national television.
Yeah, apparently they did not audition.
I'd like to thank you on behalf of the group, and I hope we pass the audition.
And then we have the folk group Phyllis, Felix, and Phil. We have Judy Pioli as Phyllis, the lead singer. Judy's a TV writer, producer, director who made occasional acting cameos on the sitcoms she worked on. Back in season 7 of Happy Days, for instance, she was one of the She-Devils. She also played guest roles on Mork and Mindy, Laverne and Shirley, and Step by Step. As a writer-producer, her credits include Laverne and Shirley, Good Time Girls, Webster, Valerie, Charles in Charge, and more. She also directed episodes of The Golden Girls, Perfect Strangers, Wings, and other sitcoms. Rick Dano is Felix. He's the one with the mustache. Rick is a New York actor whose career in TV and film started in the mid-1970s and is still going today. Gary Marshall also used him on Laverne and Shirley. Rick's movies include Ron Howard's Splash, plus Speed, Flight of the Intruder, and Big Wednesday. On the small screen, Rick's been on Supernatural, Criminal Minds, Deadwood, Dynasty, Quincy, Freddy's Nightmares, and many more. And finally, we have Ronnie Sperling as Phil. He's the one with the beard and the glasses. Ronnie is an actor and writer from LA who's had an interesting career in TV and film since the early 80s. Before Happy Days, he was in the Billy Wilder movie Buddy Buddy with Jack Lemmon and Walter Matthau. After Happy Days, he was in the movies Postal Worker and Cutting Class, plus the first live-action Transformers and a couple of episodes of Zoe 101. He also wrote for the Mighty Morphin Power Rangers TV series in the 1990s. Ronnie does a lot of theater and stand-up comedy, including casino and corporate gigs.
I own golf courses, buildings, resorts, the Miss USA pageant.
Plus, he's appeared in commercials for Nintendo, Holiday Inn, Coke, McDonald's, and many more. Peter, what did you think of our folk group, Phyllis, Felix, and Phil?
They're mostly just there to evoke Peter, Paul, and Mary in their appearances and their performance. Yeah, they're pretty good at that. Phyllis is the one who gets the most to do, and that after their performance before Joanie and Chachi, Phyllis immediately hits one of her bandmates on the head with her tambourine and tells him not to touch her. So that was kind of fun, just like playing off this idea of nicey nice folk singers, and she's actually a very mean person.
That was what I found funny about them, too. They have this very sweet, lovey-dovey act, and then as soon as they're off stage, they hate each other. I don't think the real Peter, Paul, and Mary were that way, but it's funny for this one sitcom. As for songs, this is a very music-heavy episode. The Jukebox at Arnold's plays Blowin' in the Wind by Peter, Paul, and Mary. Bob Dylan originally wrote and recorded this song in 1962, but it was Peter, Paul, and Mary's cover version that became a top 10 hit in 1963. It's been heard on Happy Days a few times before. At Fonzie's request, Arnold sings a bit of At the Hop, which became a #1 hit for Danny and the Juniors in 1958.
Let's go to the hop. Let's go to the hop.
Joanie and Casey sing Pretty Little Dutch Girl, a nursery rhyme often used to accompany a clapping game or jumping rope.
I am a pretty little Dutch girl, as pretty can be.
It goes back to New York City in the 1940s. There are many sets of lyrics, not to mention very similar songs like Miss Susie Had a Steamboat and A Sailor Went to Sea. Peter, how familiar were you with these jump rope rhymes or clapping games, these little songs that kids sing to each other?
I did not personally take part in any of those because I was not very good at either hand clapping or jumping rope. My hand-eye coordination was terrible.
I was more familiar with this song as Miss Susie Had a Steamboat. You know, Miss Susie had a steamboat, the steamboat had a bell. Miss Susie went to heaven, the steamboat went to Hello Operator. You know, have you ever heard that version?
Mm-hmm.
Phyllis, Felix, and Phil perform a song called Put Some Light Out Where the Sun Don't Ever Shine.
Put some light out where the sun don't ever shine.
This is not a real folk song. It was written for this episode. I think the idea here is to do a joke on the phrase, stick it where the sun don't shine. What did you think of Phyllis, Felix, and Phil's Put Some Light Out Where the Sun Don't Ever Shine?
It's all right. If you like Peter, Paul, and Mary, you'll probably like this song. But then again, if you like Peter, Paul, and Mary, you can just listen to Peter, Paul, and Mary instead.
I think this is a pretty convincing folk pastiche. Joanie and Chachi perform both rock and folk versions of Come Go With Me.
Oh, love, love me, darling. Come and go with me. Please don't send me.
This was a top 10 hit for a doo-wop group called the Del Vikings in 1957.
Well, love, love me, darling. Come and go with me. Come and go with me.
What did did you think of their folk version of Come Go With Me at the end of the episode?
It was alright. It's not the worst Joanie and Chachi performance.
And I thought the song lent itself surprisingly well to a folk rock adaptation. Joanie and Chachi also sing Jimmy Crack Corn, also known as Blue Tail Fly.
Jimmy Crack Corn, and I don't care.
This is a folk song that goes back to blackface minstrel shows in the 1840s.
Jimmy Crack Corn, and I don't care. My master's gone away.
On the surface, the song is about a slave mourning his master's death in a horse riding accident, but there may be some sly subtext suggesting the slave is actually celebrating. Were you very familiar with Jimmy Crack Corn or the Blue Tail Fly?
I did not know that that was what it was about. I'm also not as surprised as I would have been before that it's a blackface minstrel song, because it turns out a lot of the Great American Songbook started out as blackface minstrel songs.
Tom Bosley sings a bit of They Can't Take That Away From Me.
No, they can't take that away from me.
This is a song by George and Ira Gershwin, originally recorded by Fred Astaire for the movie Shall We Dance. It's since become a jazz and pop standard. It was never recorded by Glenn Miller, though. At the end of the episode, Howard and Marion dance to Moonlight Serenade, a swing ballad written and recorded by Glenn Miller in 1939. Moonlight Serenade became Glenn's signature song and was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 1991. As for cultural and historical references, this entire episode revolves around the so-called folk revival, a time when musicians started rediscovering the traditional American music that predated jazz, country, and rock and roll. This movement peaked in the 1960s, but it started in New York in the late 1940s, so Fonzie has had plenty of time to get used to it. The first of the folk acts to break through to a wider audience was the Weavers, led by Pete Seeger.
This land is your land. This land is my land. From California to the New York Island.
But the early folkies were political and controversial and suspected of being commies, so it was a more watered-down version of folk music that became popular in the late 50s and early 60s.
Like the New Christy Minstrels, who got their name from the Christy Minstrels, who were blackface minstrels.
Green, green, it's green, they say, on the far side of the hill.
It all goes back to those minstrel shows, Peter.
Yeah, but the New Christy Minstrels didn't even perform in blackface. Why would you name yourself after a blackface group at all?
Well, I will have to ask then, Peter, what is your personal experience with folk music and listening to it or enjoying it or not enjoying it?
I have listened to it off and on. I went through a Bob Dylan phase in high school because of the movie I'm Not There, directed by Todd Haynes. I also really love A Mighty Wind, directed by Christopher Guest, which is all about folk music.
We are so excited to be part of this project.
Oh, absolutely. It's something of a challenge for me because I don't like folk music.
Me too.
I grew up in a household where my parents were both very into folk music and would occasionally take us to folk music concerts, so it's been part of my life since early childhood. And like you, I absolutely love the movie A Mighty Wind, which shows you the different kinds of folk groups that there were, like the ones who were more message-oriented and political, and then the ones who were the softer, more watered-down, sellout type of acts. In the movie, it's a group called the Main Street Singers, who are directly based on the New Christy Minstrels.
What with the continuing interest in folk music and hootenannies, I got to worrying the other day. What kind of folk songs will he be singing 100 years from now?
A hootenanny is a party where folk music is performed. It's a nonsense word like doohickey or thingamajig. From 1963 to 1964, there was a TV show on ABC called Hootenanny.
Have a hootenanny, hootenanny, Saturday night. Take the roof and crackers song.
Featuring folk acts like Judy Collins, the Chad Mitchell Trio, the New Christy Minstrels, and more. Johnny Cash even appeared on the show. But Hootenanny was widely disliked and even boycotted among folk musicians because they wouldn't book more political acts like Pete Seeger and the Weavers. Ultimately, the show was killed off by the British invasion. Peter, were you familiar at all with the TV show Hootenanny before this episode?
I was not.
One of the records that Fonzie destroys is by the Kingston Trio, a clean-cut group from the San Francisco scene who played a more commercial, audience-friendly brand of folk music.
I mean, this one is the Kingston Trio.
Let me see that. You're right. They just broke up.
In 1958, they had a #1 hit with their version of Tom Dooley. In total, they had 5 #1 albums. Fonzie jokes that they just broke up. The group existed from 1957 to 1967, but various lineups have existed since then. Altogether, 16 different guys have been in the Kingston Trio.
I only know their rendition of Tom Dooley. I think it's a pretty good one, but I don't have much to base it off of.
That's also what I know about them as Tom Dooley. But at one time, they were a juggernaut in the entertainment industry. Fonzie mentions a whole list of artists whose records were thrown out of the jukebox, including Buddy Holly, Chuck Berry, and Dwayne Eddy and the Rockin' Rebels. Dwayne Eddy is a guitarist from New York State known for his trademark twangy sound. Duane had a series of hit instrumentals in the late 1950s and early 1960s, including Rebel Rouser and Peter Gunn. He was still having hits in 1963 when this story is taking place, so it was a bit premature to kick him out of the jukebox. His backing band, by the way, was just the Rebels. The Rockin' Rebels were a surf rock group from Buffalo. They added the word rockin' to their name specifically so they wouldn't be confused with Duane Eddy's band. Meanwhile, Texas singer-songwriter Buddy Holly had been dead for 4 years by the time the story took place, so his career had come to a halt. I thought he had a lot of post-mortem hits, but no, he only had one, It Doesn't Matter Anymore, which peaked a month after his fatal plane crash in February 1959. The rest of Buddy's hits all happened during his lifetime.
Maybe you were getting him confused with James Dean, who had 2 of his 3 movies come out after he died.
We've talked a lot about Chuck Berry on this podcast since Happy Days references him frequently. Legal problems derailed Chuck's career in the early 1960s and kept him off the charts, but he started making hits again in 1964, the year after this story takes place, including Nadine and No Particular Place to Go, so his career was not over. Marion says Joanie has come home, just like Lassie. Lassie Come Home was a popular 1943 film from MGM starring Roddy McDowall and Elizabeth Taylor. It was the first movie about the adventurous collie, and it was based on the novel Lassie Come Home by Eric Knight. In the film, a Yorkshire family has to give up their beloved dog because of the Depression, but the dog escapes from her wealthy new owner and returns to her family, surviving many perils along the way.
Everything I know about Lassie comes from pop culture osmosis.
Lassie gets referenced in a lot of other TV shows and movies and things.
What's that, girl? Timmy's in the well? Also, I'd like to point out that all of the dogs who have played Lassie have been male dogs, which means that Lassie is technically a drag act.
Marion says Lawrence Welk is going to be on TV the next night. Big band leader Lawrence Welk had his own weekly variety series from 1951 to 1982. It started as a local program in Los Angeles for 4 years, moved to ABC for 16 more, and then continued in syndication for 11 additional years. At the time of this story in 1963, Lawrence Welk was airing on Saturday nights on ABC right after Hootenanny, so this is all accurate. You ever check out the Lawrence Welk Show, Peter?
No, not really. My main exposure to him is the DC Comics parody superhero Super Hip, whose catchphrase is "Bleck to Lawrence Welk," and the recurring parody on SNL that they used to do.
Yes, with Fred Armisen as Lawrence Welk.
Thank you. Welcome back to the Lawrence Welk Show. Aren't these bubbles wonderful? If I could have them follow me around everywhere, I would.
Chachi says the TV show Hootenanny will be broadcast live from the university. In truth, Hootenanny was taped at 6 different colleges. They would arrive on Monday for rehearsal, then tape on Tuesday and Wednesday, with students sitting in the audience and some working behind the scenes. Joanie says she and Chachi might be in beach movies. Low-budget beach party movies were common in America from 1963 to 1968. The series started with American International Pictures' Beach Party, starring Frankie Avalon and Annette Funicello, and inspired a whole string of sequels. Other independent producers started making their own beach party movies, too, like Catalina Caper from Crown International Pictures. Were you into beach party movies at all? Have you enjoyed them? Or
No, but I do want to watch the one where Annette Funicello and Frankie Avalon have their beach taken over by a bunch of coded gay bodybuilders led by Don Rickles.
Onward, men! The war's begun! Now, wait a minute, Fanny!
The thing that's interesting to me about beach party movies is that they were only popular for about 5 years, but they inspired dozens of parodies for decades.
Yeah, in 2013, there was a Disney Channel original movie called Teen Beach Movie, which was essentially an homage to the Funicello and Avalon movies.
After Casey and Joanie perform their little clapping game, Chachi says, "All I know is Barnacle Bill the Sailor." He's referring to an American drinking song that's been around since at least the 1920s. Like Pretty Little Dutch Girl, Barnacle Bill has many sets of lyrics and is known under a number of titles, including Abraham Brown and Bollocky Bill the Sailor. The song has had quite a life of its own, including being in a Betty Boop cartoon and having a rock on Mars named after it. Louis Jordan even recorded a version of the song with clean lyrics.
Well, it's only me from over the sea, said Barnacle Bill the Sailor.
The folk group Phyllis, Felix, and Phil is an obvious parody of Peter, Paul, and Mary, a folk trio that formed in New York in 1961 and toured and recorded for the rest of the 1960s, performing periodically after that. Besides Blowin' in the Wind, their big hits include Puff the Magic Dragon, which was heard many times on Happy Days, and Leaving on a Jet Plane. Peter, any particular feelings about Peter, Paul, and Mary, the real ones?
Not really. I like some of their songs, but I have no strong opinions on them, really.
My father was a big folk music listener. His favorites were Judy Collins and Joan Baez, but he would listen to some Peter, Paul, and Mary as well. I mentioned the Chad Mitchell Trio. They had a song called Lizzie Borden, and my dad would sing that song to us when we were kids.
'Cause you can't chop your papa up in Massachusetts, not even if it's planned as a surprise. A surprise! No, you can't chop your papa up in Massachusetts. You know how neighbors love to criticize.
I guess that's a good thing to tell your kids.
Howard says that Marion has been watching too much Dragnet. Dragnet is an incredibly influential police procedural series following the adventures of an LA cop named Joe Friday, originally played by Jack Webb. It started as a radio show in 1949 and ran for 314 episodes. It became a TV series in 1951 and ran until 1959 and was revived in 1967 and ran until 1970. There have since been reboots in 1989 and 2003. There were also Dragnet movies in 1954 and 1987. Peter, how much Dragnet have you taken in over the years?
I have seen the Christmas episode with Barry Williams from the Brady Bunch. That's it.
Nick at Night used to show the late 60s version of Dragnet. That was the one with hippies and drugs and references to Timothy Leary and LSD.
I'm going to be honest, that sounds very Republican.
It was. Jack Webb was very, very conservative, and he hated drugs and hippies and the counterculture, and he got all that into Dragnet 1967. Howard says to Fonzie,
Hey, those Packers, they're really something, aren't they?
under the direction of coach Vince Lombardi, the Green Bay Packers were a dynasty in the early 1960s. They won back-to-back NFL championships during the 1961 and 1962 seasons. In 1963, they had a record of 11 wins, 2 losses, and 1 tie. Both losses were to the Chicago Bears. They finished in second place in the NFL Western Division that year and won the NFL Playoff Bowl against the Browns 40-23. Fonzie says that the T-Bird was nature's perfect car until some guy came along and put a back seat in it. The Ford Thunderbird was a luxury sports car first introduced in 1955 as a response to the Corvette. It was a success, but in 1958, a Ford executive named Robert McNamara, later to become the Secretary of Defense and one of the architects of the Vietnam War, decided that being a 2-seater was limiting the car's sales potential. So a second row of seats was added. As a result, the Thunderbird sales increased dramatically, and the T-Bird became one of the iconic cars of the 1960s.
And she'll have fun, 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 till her daddy takes the T-Bird away. Fun, 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 till her daddy takes the T-Bird.
Since Fonzie doesn't actually even drive a car or own one, what does he care if the T-Bird has a second row of seats in it, Peter?
It's about the principle of the thing, man.
Okay, then the principle is this. Fonzie's the makeout king, right? Wouldn't he want a car with a back seat?
That's a very good point.
Howard says that he knew the big band era was over when Elvis Presley appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show. In the early 1940s, when swing was king, jazz music was dominated by groups known as big bands or jazz orchestras consisting of 10 or more musicians, including trumpets, trombones, saxophones, etc. Popular band leaders of that time included Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Guy Lombardo, and more. Big band music has never totally gone away, but it had definitely fallen out of favor long before Elvis Presley appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in September of 1956. So Howard was not very much in tune with the zeitgeist. You ever listen to any big band music, Peter?
Yeah, Sing, Sing, Sing. That's a classic.
Howard says he knew he wouldn't see much more of Senior Wenceslas, and even does a little impression of Wenceslas.
Joy.
But this makes no sense at all. First of all, Senior Wenceslas was a Spanish ventriloquist, not a musician, so Elvis Presley had no effect on his career whatsoever. Secondly, Wenceslas was a mainstay on Ed Sullivan from 1952 until 1967, long after Elvis Presley appeared on the show, and Wenceslas kept appearing on TV through the 1970s and 80s, including guest shots on The Muppet Show and Late Night with David Letterman. Peter, were you familiar with Senior Wenceslas at all?
Yes, entirely because of his appearance on The Muppet Show.
Elvis Presley didn't put Senior Wenceslas out of business.
They fill 2 completely different functions.
Howard also talks about his love of Glenn Miller, a trombone player and big band leader who was incredibly popular in the late 30s and early 40s. During World War II, Glenn volunteered to join the Air Force to entertain the troops. Tragically, while doing this, he was killed in a plane crash in 1944. Howard talks about having all of Glenn Miller's albums.
I got them all, Fonzie. Every album that Glenn Miller ever recorded.
Glenn had a lot of hit records in his day, even more than Elvis Presley or the Beatles, but they were all singles. Albums weren't really a thing until well after Glenn Miller's death. Obviously, his music has been compiled on many albums since then. Howard mentions a few of Glenn's hits, including Moonlight Serenade and A String of Pearls. Moonlight Serenade we already talked about. A String of Pearls is a song composed by Jerry Gray and originally recorded by Glenn Miller and his orchestra in 1941. It hit number 1 for Glenn in 1942. Fonzie mentions a pen that writes through butter. I have no idea what he's referring to, but in their 1948 film Heavenly Days, the Three Stooges claim to have invented a pen that writes under whipped cream.
Why would anybody want a fountain pen that writes under whipped cream?
Well, a fella can be on the desert where there ain't any water to write under, can't he?
Nowadays, though, you can buy a pen that writes even in the rain or through grease. Would you want a pen that was able to write through butter or grease?
Well, no, but I guess it would be useful to have if I needed it.
Howard jokes about Fats Domino writing minuets.
That if everyone thought the same way you did, Fats Domino would have written minuets.
A minuet is a type of French ballroom dance that was popular in the 18th century. Lots of composers wrote minuets in the 1700s and 1800s, but the dance eventually went out of style and composers moved on to other forms. New Orleans pianist Antoine Fats Domino came along well after the heyday of the minuet and was one of the founders of rock and roll. We've talked about him many times in the podcast. Would you recognize a minuet if you heard one?
Probably not.
You know when fancy people get together for a party and you hear dun-dun-dun-dun-dun, that's a minuet.
Yeah.
Chachi is seen wearing a neck rack, which allows a musician to play a harmonica while also playing a guitar.
You're getting the teeth straightened. No, Fonzie. This is just part of the great news we got to tell you.
This particular accessory was closely associated with Bob Dylan during the early folk rock phase of his career. Does Chachi ever actually use that neck rack?
I don't think he does.
Fonzie criticizes the song Michael Row the Boat Ashore.
You know, this morning on the radio I heard this song about this guy rowing a boat to shore. Where else is he going to row the boat?
This started as an African-American spiritual during the Civil War. It's about slaves leaving St. Helena Island off the coast of South Carolina when their owners abandoned it. A folk group called the Highwaymen had a #1 hit with it called Michael in 1961.
Michael row the boat ashore, hallelujah.
Ashley badly misquotes a line from Little Richard's Tutti Frutti. She says,
Go wom babaloo baba boom bam boom.
The real line is, Little Richard claimed this was a nonsense phrase he used to yell at his boss when he was a dishwasher. Fonzie speculates that folk music is a communist plot.
It is a communist plot.
In real life, many of the early folk musicians had far-left political leanings and were accused of being communists and subversives and were blacklisted for that reason. That's why it took a decade for folk music to break through commercially. And it took a group like the Kingston Trio, Peter. You know, they all have neat haircuts and dress nice and smile and play nice music for the people.
And they're definitely not communists.
Fonzie asks why they stopped putting real wood on station wagons. Automobile manufacturers started putting wood paneling on the sides of vehicles in the 1930s and 40s. These large, roomy cars became known as woodies. They later became popular with surfers because used models were available cheap and had plenty of trunk space for surfboards. Car companies stopped making woodies in the early 1950s, however, for a number of reasons. Strength, cost, safety, and durability. After that, car companies continued to evoke the era of woodies with simulated wood grain siding and sheet vinyl appliques. Were you familiar with that at all? Station wagons that had the wood sides?
Yes, but only, once again, through pop culture osmosis.
Fonzie also complains about watches that work underwater. Waterproof watches were in development as far back as the 1870s, but the first commercially available model was the Rolex Oyster in 1926. What I think Fonzie is reacting to, however, is a series of Timex commercials featuring announcer John Cameron Swayze and the slogan, "It takes a licking and keeps on ticking." Swayze would show the watches working under various conditions, including being underwater.
Just like the clock John Cameron Swayze displayed last night on the old TV. Oh, it works underwater so perfectly, and it still makes a ticking sound.
Fonzie is also upset by Minute Rice. This quick-cooking rice was first widely used by the Army during World War II. It's been commercially available since 1946. It was heavily marketed by General Foods in the 1950s. Ashley talks about Elvis Presley getting his Army haircut. Elvis Presley was inducted into the United States Army in 1958 when he was the most popular entertainer in the world. He served from 1958 to 1960, ultimately achieving the rank of sergeant. But Elvis's management had prepared for his hiatus, stockpiling enough material to keep him on the charts. After his honorable discharge, he continued his career making movies and records. Peter, have you ever seen Elvis with the Army haircut?
Yeah, and I gotta say, it's not a great look for him. Not very flattering.
No more ducktail hairdo and them sideburns are a-going to, hey Elvis, you're a GI now.
Joanie and Chachi write an original folk song called The Ballad of the Left-Footed Sheriff. In real life, many folk songs tell tragic stories about death and murder. In fact, Tom Dooley is about a man who is due to be hanged for murder. Did you want to hear The Ballad of the Left-Footed Sheriff?
I did! It does not sound like a great song, but it does sound like an amazing song, if you know what I mean.
I think it would have been more fun to have that instead of them doing a serious song. Howard says that when he was Joanie and Chachi's age, he wanted a Hupmobile and a zoot suit.
Well, I wanted a Hupmobile and I wanted a zoot suit.
The Hupmobile was an automobile built by the Hupp Motor Company of Detroit from 1909 to 1939. Sales started to decline in the 1920s because Hupp couldn't keep up with its competitors in terms of technology. Eventually, the Depression killed the company for good. The zoot suit was a style of flashy men's suit with wide shoulders and lapels, long coats, and pegged trousers. They were especially popular with young African-American and Hispanic men in the 1940s, long after the heyday of the Hupmobile. So the Hupmobile and zoot suit dream is not one that could have ever come true. They were from different times. Other observations this week, they already got a second use out of that special intro for Joanie and Chachi during the theme song.
Money and time well spent.
Jenny's corruption of KC continues right on schedule. This week, Jenny wants KC to help her cheat on a test. We never do get a resolution on that, Peter. What do you think happened?
It could have been the setup to like a fun B-plot, but I guess they thought this episode had enough plot as it is, and so it's just a toss-off joke, which is a shame because, like I said, could have been a fun B-plot.
The Cunninghams have Casey cleaning their bathtub, which she says was a grueling chore to complete.
Well, the beds were all made and the tubs were all spotless. Boy, those tubs were filthy. I had the worst.
Is she being treated like Cinderella behind the scenes, Peter?
Oh, God, maybe. I want to believe Howard and Marion wouldn't do that, but maybe they would.
That just amused me to think that that's how they're treating her.
Cinderella, Cinderella, night and day it's Cinderella. Make the fire, fix the breakfast, wash the dishes, do the mopping.
Even if Fonzie doesn't like folk music, he should still support Joanie and Chachi because he cares about them. It shouldn't matter what kind of music they're playing.
You've said it yourself. He has to be the bride at every funeral and the corpse at every wedding. Everything is about him.
He couldn't just put aside his ego for one night and just be nice about this just because it's his cousin and Joanie playing at this thing.
It's lucky that I found that very funny because otherwise it would be insufferable.
Yeah, he's really on terrible behavior this week. Peter, were there any outstanding Happy Days fashions in this episode?
I love Marion's outfit for when they go to see Hootenanny. She's wearing this yellow and black dress and shawl ensemble. You know the shawl. It's like that kind of mid-20th century outfit. It's kind of also a jacket, and you stick your arms through the holes, and she's also got gloves and a little hat. It's just really great.
What is your general feeling about the folk music hippie fashion aesthetic?
It's not terribly engaging in this episode. I guess they didn't really want to go whole hog with it, especially since this episode takes place before hippie culture really flowered, so to speak.
The thing that they miss, though, is that in real life, Peter and Paul from Peter, Paul, and Mary, they wore suits. And the other thing that they missed was both Peter and Paul had goatees. That was like a big part of their look. If you look at any picture of Peter, Paul, and Mary, there's this lovely blonde hippie lady, and then there's two guys who look like cartoon devils on either side of her.
Well, we know that Peter, Paul, and Mary exist in the Happy Days universe because we hear their rendition of Blowin' in the Wind in this episode, and I guess they didn't want to make it look like Phyllis, Felix, and Phil were going too hard into being the extremely poor man's Peter, Paul, and Mary.
So, Peter, I will ask that age-old timeless question. Was this episode any good?
This was a fun, if inconsequential episode. There were some good jokes sprinkled throughout, and admittedly, I think the main reason why I enjoyed this episode was because Fonzie is once again being a melodramatic diva. And that's funny to me, but like I said, if anyone doesn't find that funny, it's probably just going to come across as insufferable.
That is the real crux of this episode. Do you find Fonzie's behavior to be funny, or do you find it to be really frustrating and irritating? I did find it funny because Fonzie is stuck in this 1950s greaser mode well into the 1960s, and so there would eventually come a time when he has to face the fact that times have changed and fashion has changed and music has changed.
Fashion has changed.
No, it hasn't.
And they would have to do an episode like this eventually, so I'm glad that they addressed it, because it's kind of the elephant in the room here. Fonzie can't stay in the 50s forever, although he definitely tries. There's going to be another better episode about Fonzie being stuck in the 50s mindset. So
yes, there is. We're not going to give away too many details, but trust me, it's coming and it's amazing.
That one is great. This one is actually pretty good. I like the folk music Hootenanny parodies in this one, so definitely give Who Gives a Hootenanny a watch. So, Peter, what do we have on the docket for next week?
Next week, the return of Paula Pedrolonga in Going Steady.
I did not expect her to resurface, but here she is in season 10, so see you later, alligator.
In a while, crocodile.
Whenever I'm out a-wandering, chasing a rainbow dream, I often stop and think about a place I've never seen,
where friendly folks can gather and raise the rafters high,
with songs and tales of yesteryear until they say goodbye.
Well, there's a puppy in the parlor and a skillet on the stove and a smelly old blanket that a Navajo wove. There's chicken on the table, but you gotta say grace. There's always something cooking at Old Joe's place.
Go on, babaloo, baba boom, bam boom.